All right, I think we will get started as people continue to trickle in. Welcome all. Very excited to have you all here today and very excited to have our distinguished lineup of speakers. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are dialing in from. I'm Charlotte Moyens. I'm a senior manager with the Strong Cities Network, which, for those who are unfamiliar, just very briefly, is a global independent network of over 160 cities. And by cities, I mean capital cities, rural villages, border towns, the whole spectrum of local governance. And the Strong Cities Network is dedicated to helping these actors, to supporting city-led efforts to prevent and counter extremism, hate, and polarization. Essentially helping cities develop, deploy, sustain prevention policies and programs that correspond with both international practice as well as related national frameworks and strategies. I'm pleased to welcome you all here today to our webinar on the state of play of national local cooperation in preventing and countering violent extremism. The webinar will last 1 hour and will examine some of our initial findings into the status of national local cooperation in different contexts around the world. So before I jump into some background about the initiative that inspired today's webinar, I would like to give some housekeeping points. Today's session is intended to be interactive, so we encourage you all to ask questions, either using the chat box or the Q&A function that Zoom provides, which you'll find at the bottom bar of your Zoom screen. Feel free to ask questions throughout the session, of course. We do have a dedicated portion of the agenda at the end to answer those questions, so we will pick them up during that time. A quick note also to say that this webinar is being recorded and it will be available on our YouTube channel in the coming days. We also have interpretation available from English to French. To access this, please refer again to the bottom bar of your Zoom screen, where you should see a little globe that says interpretation underneath, and then click on the appropriate channel to be able to access that. Okay, with all of that said, I'll give a very quick overview of why we are here today. So in 2020, the Strong Cities Network contributed with support from the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to the Global Counterterrorism Forum's Memorandum on Good Practices on Strengthening National Local Cooperation in Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism Conducive to Terrorism, which I believe my colleagues are posting into the chat now. So in the course of drafting this memorandum, we consulted with more than 75 practitioners across national and local government, civil society, multilateral organizations, and academia from over 35 countries. The memorandum essentially outlines 13 good practices to strengthen national local cooperation for preventing and countering extremism, examples of which include holding inclusive consultative dialogue between national and local actors on the topic of preventing and countering violent extremism, investing in local actors and frameworks and programs, facilitating information sharing between relevant actors at the national and local levels, and balancing national leadership with local ownership. You can read more by clicking the link in the chat. So as follow-up to establishing the memorandum in the first place, we wanted to then understand the progress of countries and regions in different contexts around the world with actually implementing those good practices. To this end, we worked with the 4 panelists that you see here today to conduct in-depth analyses of the continued barriers to and potential solutions for enhancing national local cooperation in 4 contexts: East and Southern Africa, West Africa, and then 2 country-specific analyses, one in Indonesia and one in Uganda. Over the course of 3 months, our distinguished speakers conducted interviews and surveys with dozens of stakeholders at the national and local levels. And we are very excited and very grateful to have them here with us today to be able to share a little bit more about this work, as well as to talk a little bit about some of the key challenges and potential recommendations for enhancing national local cooperation to prevent and counter violent extremism. Findings from this process have informed a policy brief that we will share via email with all of you in the coming days, and will also inform a toolkit on implementing the good practices, which I will speak a little bit more about later. With that, I'm very pleased to introduce our lineup of speakers. In alphabetical order, we have Francis Ansong, an independent researcher from Ghana who conducted our West Africa study. Francis is an experienced bilingual senior executive with over 10 years of demonstrated professional experience in conflict analysis, peace building, and working with international organizations in both technical and managerial capacities. Francis is joined today by Christopher Hockey, a research fellow from the Royal United Services Institute Nairobi, or RUSI Nairobi short, who conducted our East Africa study. Christopher joined RUSI Nairobi as a research fellow in 2019 and is involved in several countering violent extremism projects in Kenya with an emphasis on research, monitoring and evaluation, and violence tracking. We also have Muhammad Rizki Maulana, Managing Director at the Institute for International Peacebuilding, who conducted our study in Indonesia. Rizki is a former journalist who holds a master's degree in peace and conflict studies and is currently involved in research related to peace, conflict, and violent extremism. And last but not least, we have Dr. Ashad Santongo, Director of Africa Programs at the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, who has done our study in Uganda. Dr. Ashad works with member states of the African Union Commission to build the African Network for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, and provides training and technical assistance to national regional mechanisms. He consults on national security policy, prevention and countering violent extremism, conflict analysis, as well as peace building. So I'd like to begin today's session by inviting each of our four speakers to share a little bit more about the work they've done and some of the barriers to national local cooperation that they have identified in the initiative that I described earlier. We will start with Francis, who will provide a short overview of the work he did in West Africa, and then take us through the challenges of an overly centralized approach to prevention and a resulting lack of local autonomy and ownership over prevention programs and policies. Francis, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charlotte, and greetings to everyone who's taking time to join us today. Before I start, I did like to, express appreciation to those who took time off their busy schedules to at least, interact with us and also provide us perspectives and insights on the status of national local cooperation in your various countries. It was really helpful and was very key to the development of this toolkit. I, just as part of the team of consultants, I focus on West Africa, like Charlotte rightly said, which covered 15 countries. And as we all know, while West Africa in recent years has faced numerous challenges, one of the key barriers to national local cooperation that I did like to highlight is the centralized nature of governments and the lack of autonomy of local actors. During this mapping exercise, we realized that there's a domination of political power by central government or national governments, which has in turn meant that local actors are often restricted on what they can or what they cannot do. In most cases, when we've seen that there's a large consensus that yes, there are ongoing efforts to decentralize power. However, decentralization, as it has been observed across West Africa, is often said to only exist on paper and not a reality on the ground. Generally, the national security issues or national measures or strategies that are put in place, because they are perceived to be, the sole responsibility of the state or national governments, this then tends to, leave out sometimes, if often than not, leave out local actors during the consultative process or during the drafting of these policies or strategies. And once they are left out, these documents do not reflect the local needs and priorities of the communities that often than not are kind of affected by the issue of violent extremism across the sub-region. For instance, we realize that in an effort, and most often than not, it's said to be a genuine effort by national actors, in an effort to implement initiatives that seek to, build community resilience and also prevent violent extremism, some national actors have ignored principles such as do no harm. And this in turn goes to, kind of like, it contributes to the breakdown of trust between security forces, who are often seen as representatives of the central government or the national government, and the local communities that they are there to help. And as often, these initiatives that are meant to counter this transnational threat at a local level, when are not conducted in a very, should I say, structured manner, tends to not only create more harm, but push the local community towards some of these groups that are not well intended for the population. And this has been seen across the sub-region. It has also been said that, this has contributed to not only the breakdown of trust, but also the key role that local actors are supposed to even play at a community level. And once the trust is broken, once the authority of local actors are not being respected, are not being seen, then it's an open field for whoever or for some of these VEOs to come in and impose themselves in all these gray or often uninhabited areas or often ungoverned areas across the sub-region. It is also said that due to the high level of political polarization, where often than not, national governments tend to monopolize issues that are related to countering or preventing violent extremism to gain political or for political points. And in doing so, they tend to leave out, opponents or people or local mayors and governors who are perceived to come from the opposition, because they feel that once those are left out, it makes them more popular, or when initiatives that the national actors are implementing, it makes them more visible to those communities. And more often than not, these things, when they are being done and do not take into consideration the dynamics at a local level, tend to sometimes cause harm and also not reflect the priorities of the local communities as well. Finally, I would like to point out that during this mapping exercise, it was interesting to know that fewer than half of the countries in West Africa have developed a dedicated national action plan or any relevant policy framework to prevent or counter violent extremism across the region. In addition, it's also observed that the existing action plans and frameworks are not accessible to the public, and those that have been developed typically do not clearly define the roles and responsibilities of local actors. I'll stop here and hand over to my other colleagues in case they have something else to add to it.
Thank you so much, Francis. I think, several very relevant points and challenges that we've seen as a Strong Cities Network in other contexts beyond West Africa, not just as part of this initiative, as I'm sure colleagues on the panel will agree, but also in a wider mapping, for example, that we've done with support from the European Union on the role of cities in general across the African continent, where they struggle with accessing the national plans, as you've mentioned, and they're not consulted at all in the first place in the drafting of those plans. So that understanding that cities have of the local dynamics is missing almost entirely from the plans that are then put forward to prevent and counter extremism in those contexts. I will now, unless anyone from the panel wants to respond to what Francis said, I will now pass on to Christopher Hockey, a research fellow from the Royal United Services Institute, Nairobi. Christopher, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Charlotte. And as Francis said, at first I want to thank all those who we interviewed and who helped us produce this piece of work. And also to my two colleagues, the East and Southern African part of this study wasn't only conducted by me. I worked with Timothy Kamayo and Michael Jones. So I want to first just provide a few overall findings before looking at a couple of themes in my initial 5 minutes. Our study looked at 10 countries across the region. These were Burundi, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, Mozambique, Rwanda, Somalia, South Sudan, Tanzania, and Uganda. And I think it's really critical that I list those, because you'll see that there's a huge variation across them in terms of experience with PCVE and information therefore available. Much more available, for example, on Kenya and Somalia than there might be for somewhere like Burundi or South Sudan. Only a few countries have actually made any start at establishing national frameworks, let alone local strategies. And only Kenya, of all those 10 countries, has made any progress against all the good practices recommended by GCTF. Other countries, a second group, Somalia and Uganda, have produced national frameworks promoting a whole of society approach, but with minimal implementation to date. A third category, Djibouti, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Mozambique, have engaged with non-coercive approaches to PCV or to violent extremism, but have minimal legal frameworks in place. And finally, another group, Burundi, Rwanda, and South Sudan, have had minimal engagement at all with this sort of work. So overall, we found several themes across that really were pretty prevalent in all locations. These were barriers that prevented national-local cooperation, and they're largely interrelated. Firstly, financial resources, largely dependent on foreign donors in most cases, and subsequently the foreign donors' agenda is given precedence, not necessarily in the alignment, and is not that agenda is not necessarily in alignment with local understandings and priorities, as we've just heard from Francis. Corruption was another key theme in impacting trust and transparency. Capability and knowledge of PCVE was a concern, and the sort of level of understanding of these issues or interpretation of these issues varied significantly between countries, and often the burden falls to CSOs. A preoccupation, again, we've heard this from Francis, a preoccupation with counter-terrorism, and this sort of serves to hamper trust, despite sort of efforts at a national level to push a PCV agenda. There's often a sort of reluctance to move away from harder CT approaches. And this provides real confusion as to where PCV sits, with some people seeing it closer to development and others seeing it closer to security. Next, we found that security was often seen as a function of the national government, and therefore national government was often unwilling to release information or certain aspects of control over PCV issues. We found that some of the countries in the region were more centralized than others. Some haven't really actually worked on decentralization at all. Djibouti is a particular concern in that regard. And finally, we found that in some cases, instability remains a concern. It's going to slow down slightly. Instability remains a concern in South Sudan and in Somalia, where PCV is often deprioritized in favor of CT as a result. So two themes just to highlight. Firstly, trust, which is one of the main recommendations in the GCTF document, is about building trust. So the document suggests that it's needed between all stakeholders and all levels of government. Authorities are urged to tackle the factors that undermine trust, for example, and build inclusivity, transparency, and dialogue. We found that trust is really idiosyncratic in most of the communities we are working with, and dependent a lot of the time on relationships, personalities, and rather than on positions. We found that CSOs often have more trusting relationships, but not in all cases. And this, there's a danger of suggesting that all CSOs are naturally more trusted than government actors. CSOs really are heterogeneous in their disposition, in their capacity, and their partnerships and networks. In Kenya, there's a really good examples from a recent study we conducted on the coast, in which even a CSO that was from across the county border was considered, not knowledgeable enough about the local context. Civilian trust in law enforcement is often very, very low. That's a concern on the Kenyan coast, but it's also a concern in other parts of the region. Information security is a major issue in Somalia, for example. And law enforcement, we found, was seen to use engagements with communities to collect information and gather information rather than to exchange ideas. But there has been several examples of real positives across the region of efforts to rebuild trust. Nyumba Kumi in Tanzania has been relatively successful, at least in comparison to Kenya. In Burundi, CSOs provide spaces for engagement between young people and the police, and CSOs have been working with radio stations. In Djibouti, community centers have played a really important role in boosting social cohesion and resilience. In Mozambique, the recent Northern Integrated Development Agency, or ADIN, has served to sort of start trying to rebuild that social contract between government and civil society and communities in the north. And broadly, we found that the shift away from coercive approaches towards PCV and non-coercive responses has actually helped build trust in most parts of the region. So with my sort of last minute, is just mention information sharing a little bit more, which is the sort of subsequent recommendation in the GCTF document. The recommendation is that we need clear guidelines at national and local level on frameworks and principles on how and when all stakeholders should share information in order to protect privacy, but also to increase awareness. We found that across the region, some much more mature PCV operating environments were perhaps more willing to share information. In Kenya and in Somalia, less so, but in Kenya, there is a lot of mechanisms in place to order to facilitate that sharing. The NCTC in Kenya, for example, this is the National Counterterrorism Center, increasingly exchanges with donors, local authorities, CSOs, and other stakeholders. But it often is still dependent on individual relationships and areas of expertise. And at a local level, CEFs, the County Engagement Forums, provide a mechanism for discussion, but also are hindered by competition for resources. I've got 2 more points, if I can just make them. CSO sharing platforms have also been created in several parts of the region. So in Tanzania, under the CREATE program, Mercy Corps have been able to establish a CSO-led coordination forum. In Uganda, the CSCAVE initiative, Civil Society Coalition Against VE, has been used to promote information sharing and promote and collaboration. And at a regional level, Eastern Africa is really well ahead of many other parts of the world in that IGAD have created the Center of Excellence, and this should serve as a repository for knowledge sharing and research. There was also an early initiative which we came across called the CSO Hub, created by Global Center, but this doesn't appear to still be very active. So lots of positives, but lots of variation across our region. Back to you.
Great, thank you so much. A couple of points to pick up on, maybe later when we do the Q&A and the recommendation section. You mentioned at the start, for example, that few countries that you looked at have national frameworks, and fewer still have local plans to implement those frameworks. So I'd be interested to hear later when we do the recommendations Q&A session from you and from other panelists on how we facilitate that follow through from creating a national framework to actually implementing it at the local level. And then thank you also for sharing all of those positive examples. Those are it's very important and perhaps a good framework to learn from in other contexts. So also would be interested to explore whether it's feasible to replicate those positive examples in other contexts where trust and information sharing are an issue, which I imagine is in many contexts. Thank you again. I'll now pass on to Risky, who's going to talk a little bit about the work that he's done and the challenge of coordination, lack of coordination overall.
Okay, thank you, Charlotte, for the opportunity. As introduced by Charlotte, my name is Rizky, and I am Managing Director of at Institute for International Peacebuilding, CSO based in Jakarta. And I was conducted the mapping of NLC Indonesia, NLC National Local Cooperation in Indonesia, and my focus area was in Banten Province and Central Java Province. I know that Indonesia is very large and huge country, and maybe those 2 provinces not represent all of the Indonesia as a whole, but I try to capture the best practices from those provinces. So while Indonesia as a country face many issues, that one of the key barriers I'd like to cover is lack of coordination, as mentioned earlier. In the context of the national local cooperation, what I mean by the lack of coordination here is that primarily related to the implementation of the prevention and countering violent extremism programs. Most of the prevention and countering violent extremism programs in Indonesia, which were conducted by the national government, or conducted without prior coordination and notification with the local government agencies. Meaning that since the designing phase to the implementing and monitoring were fully conducted by the national government. This lack of coordination sometimes created confusion among the local government agency, especially when something not went well. But if something going smoothly, of course, there is no complaints or anything from the program beneficiaries. But when something not went well, the local governments have to deal with the complaints from the beneficiary of the programs. Specifically in this context was that the former terrorist offenders who sometimes become the most focal beneficiaries in Indonesia related to the programs, because some programs conducted by the national government agency addressing specifically for the former terrorist offenders. And I would also like to add that not only coordination between the national and local government agencies, lack of coordination also occurred among the agencies at the national level, and also among agencies at the local level. So there is a complexity in the situation, and all of them were related still same on the implementation of the program. For the example is that if some groups of former terrorist offenders were being addressed by several different programs, by different agencies repeatedly, including CSOs, sometimes also targeting the same beneficiary. That makes the programs of the programs considered ineffective by some critics, because the thing is there are still many former terrorist inmates not being addressed by the programs, but sometimes we always are addressing the same beneficiaries. So it's always it was cannot escape from critics related to that example, and also the jealousy among the former terrorist offenders. If some groups or some individuals were always being targeted to be supported with programs, activities, or something like that, but some other groups not being targeted, that also become the problem. That's what I found. It's one of the factors is because the lack of coordination among the local agencies and among the government agencies, both at the national and the local level. And also, why I always raising the issue of the former terrorist offenders, because this is the main talking points on the ground. One of the main talking points on the ground in Indonesia about how effective the reintegration programs in Indonesia for the former terrorist offenders. So in short, that the lack of coordination happened at every level. Although currently, with the initiative from the Indonesia National Counter-Terrorism Agency, Indonesia currently have what we call it the National Action Plan on the Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism, or NAP on CVE, which has been legalized and enacted in 2021. The NAP hopefully could make the lack of coordination among the agencies reduce, because the NAP, which used the whole government approach and the whole society approach, has mandated more active role of the local governments with under supervision and coordination of the Indonesia National Counter-Terrorism Agency, which never been mentioned in the previous regulation. So it means that there is a hope that there will be massive improvement related to the coordination among the agencies, both at the national and at the local level in Indonesia. Thank you, Charlotte. That's all.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it sounds like there's a need for both vertical and horizontal, an improvement of both vertical and horizontal coordination, and that a lack of that has caused duplication in some of the programs and policies and beneficiaries that are being worked with. And I'd be interested later again for the Q&A to maybe explore a little bit with what you just mentioned about there now being a role on paper for local governments, what that kind of coordination mechanism between the national and local levels will look like in practice. But again, something to pick up later. So now, without further ado, I'm happy to pass it over to our final speaker, Dr. Ashad, who will talk a little bit about securitization.
Thank you, Charlotte. And again, I thank the participants who are joining us in this webinar, and I thank my colleagues for such wonderful work. My research focused on Uganda, and exploring national-local cooperation at different dimensions. And of course, there are a number of barriers that were identified. The question of securitization as a barrier to national-local cooperation manifests, first of all, it concerns adapting a security-centric approach, a military kind of approach to violent extremism. And securitization therefore comes in when everything around that involvement, those interventions, adopt either a security framework, or they are understood and interpreted in that context, or a military response. And that as a barrier manifests at different levels. One is at the conceptual level. Many of the drivers that have been cited in different literature tend to talk about the human security elements as key drivers to recruitment and radicalization. And when that radicalization transforms into violence, the dominant approach is security military centric. That presents a contradiction, because then the space to address the underlying issues is closed, which actually tends to attract more attention amongst the locals, the conditions of everyday living. So that becomes a problem in terms of understanding and the departure points towards prevention and countering. At a policy level, it manifests in Uganda in a sense that there is a national strategy that was developed through a consultative process where research was done in different regions of the country, with participation of some local leaders, cultural leaders, and traditional leaders to share some opinions. And a national strategy was developed. That strategy has not been rolled out to the public for implementation. Instead, there is a counter CVE strategy, countering violent extreme strategy, that is housed within the security sector. And there is a national counterterrorism center that works to implement the related activities. That is also a problem policy-wise, in a sense that there is a strategy that was developed through an inclusive process, but it doesn't influence interventions. Instead, a counterterrorism strategy is dominating and influences the intervention and the activities of the strategy, of the activities of dealing with the violent extremism in the country. At the third level, in terms of actors, securitization becomes a problem, in a sense that the capacities, the approaches, the skills, the posture that is presented by security agents is different from the type of posture, such skills, security necessary to inform prevention, dealing where different preventive initiatives that involve communities and local actors and bring them into a collective responsibility to respond to violent extremism. Those skills are different. So in terms of actors, the military, the security agents they draw their authority and orders from a centralized authority, and while communities as actors, as would-be actors in PCVE, would draw from a different set of values, a different set of skill sets, different approaches, they bring different relationships into PCVE. At that level, securitization becomes a barrier in terms of actors failing to coordinate. It doesn't mean there is no coordination. Our research revealed that there is some kind of collaboration, of contact, But normally it occurs when incidents have happened, when bombs have exploded, and then the security agents would go into communities to find out information. And at that level, they speak to local leaders and so on. And once they pick an individual to arrest, then that is done. The rest of the work is. At the fourth level, information sharing becomes a problem with securitization, because the security military-centric approach tends to classify risks, threats, and interventions and plans that rotate around that. And yet you'd expect under national local cooperation that communities are sharing information with the leadership, so that there is a shared understanding, and that the departure points and entry points into responding to violent extremism are kind of drawing on the skills, on the strength of the leadership and the communities. And it's not happening because the security approach tends to classify and therefore withhold some information, and communities are not involved into identifying. So the roles that would come as a result of that information shared by communities and local leaders at local government level, at cultural level, at a family level, where individuals are identified and then a family has a role to play, those roles are stifled in a sense that information related to threats and risks is withheld from them. That finally, securitization would dictate different forms of capacity building with relate to PCVE, that the types of capacities with a security-centric approach and the capabilities you develop in terms of responding and countering violent extremism in Uganda are different. You'll do more specialized training, create. We do have counterterrorism departments in the Uganda police and in the UPDF, and then there is including internal security organizations, and there's a lot of capacity building at that level to deal with violent extremism in the country. The capacities that communities need to also play a role and respond do not receive the type of attention. So I'm speaking very briefly. So at that level, you will find a missing link in terms of capacity building, and where the skill sets, the capacities developed are not synchronized. They can't produce the type of synergy necessary for effective national local cooperation. I'm happy to add on more information in the discussion, besides mentioning that all that tends to build a perception that violent extremism is a responsibility of the state and security agents, and then ultimately communities resign. Even resources are directed into strengthening national security and the related directorates, and they are not allocated to build community knowledge, information, and capacities. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Again, a lot of very relevant points, some of which is a little bit reminiscent of what Christopher said earlier in terms of the challenges with follow through. So once you have that national strategy, which in this case sounds like it was very consultative, at least compared to other contexts, actually rolling that out at the local level and having local actors involved in then deploying that strategy is still a gap. And I was interested in the point that you said about information sharing and collaboration still being very reactive, and there needs to be a bit of a shift to a more proactive approach where those mechanisms for information sharing exist before something happens and hopefully help prevent violence from this escalating to violence. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you to all our panelists for their important inputs. So now that we've talked a little bit about some of the barriers and challenges that our speakers today have identified in this research initiative, I'd like to turn over just briefly to ways that we can overcome these. So I'd be interested to hear from each one of you, one recommendation or some recommendations that you might have for any stakeholder, be it national level, local level, civil society, international, or indeed all of them, about how that we can overcome some of these barriers and hopefully improve and strengthen national local cooperation for preventing and countering extremism. And feel free to just unmute and share and respond to what has just been said. And then after that, we'll enter a Q&A. Francis, go ahead.
Good. So I believe one of the actors that often are not are ignored when it comes to preventing or countering violent extremism is traditional and local leaders, because normally the conversation is often on the role that national or local leaders can play, but these traditional and local leaders or religious leaders tend to play a much more salient role because they are the ones closest to the communities that are affected by the issues of violent extremism. So bringing them into that conversation, making sure there's some level of dialogue and coordination between both national, local, and those religious and local leaders, religious and traditional leaders, it's a key way to at least make sure that whatever the dynamics are on the ground, they are also involved in it. We don't develop or we don't design and then bring to them to implement, but we need to involve them from the onset to make sure that whatever tendencies or whatever trends we are seeing, they are either affirming or denying them, or at the end of the day, they are also working with the local communities to make sure that they are helping build their resilience as well. Over.
Can I just pick up on what you said, Francis? I think that's a really important point, but one thing that we're often concerned about in some of our research at RUSI is, that to assume that those traditional and local leaders, religious or otherwise, have sort of trust or credibility amongst communities is potentially sort of a little bit dangerous. We find that in many cases, it's, as I said in my presentation, it's very much dependent on the individual and on the person and his personality and his ability to actually relate to the community. That was just a response, but Charlotte, happy to suggest a couple of recommendations as well. If
go ahead, yeah.
So I think one thing that I really wanted to push was sort of the idea of building on existing locally led initiatives, and obviously this sort of feeds into the idea of mainstreaming PCV and working with existing structures. So in the case of Mozambique, that might be add-in, which I explained before, is the Northern Integrated Development Association, or working with existing UN Resolution 1325 National Action Plans on Women, Peace and Security, where these processes have sometimes been consultative, and that we can learn from that and use that sort of process. Or in South Sudan, which has no PCV background, they had an extraordinary national dialogue process which involved like 20,000 people and actually ended up being fairly critical of parts of the government. So there are often existing initiatives that we can build on, and hopefully that we can, especially in Kenya, where the government's very aware of this need to sort of mainstream PCV ideas through existing policies. We can build on those and use existing resources and finances, so it's not actually more expensive. And I think that does feed into national local cooperation, because it's a way of using these often local initiatives, but and the funding which comes with them.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the nature of what the Strong Cities Network does, we couldn't agree more with the fact that we can learn from existing initiatives that aren't branded specifically as preventing and countering violent extremism. And a big part of the work that we do with cities and other local authorities is helping them understand how those other types of initiatives that they're already rolling out, whether it has to do with employment, housing, education, how that can play a role in the broader kind of strategy to prevent extremism in the first place, and especially to prevent it from escalating to violence. Thank you for that, Christopher. Risky, Dr. Ashad, do either of you want to jump in with a response or with a recommendation?
Yes, I think we may also need to have a PCVE specific policy dialogue that brings local political leaders with the national level security actors to have a conversation on strategies and share an understanding of what actually the broader scope of PCVE, what it means, and then moving to national local cooperation. What are the dynamics? What are the roles? Who the actors are, and what structures and can we bring to bear? I did mention in the report that Uganda has one of the most elaborate local government structures, right up to, the Nyumba Kumi system in Tanzania. We have it defined differently in Uganda as local, council one. But the level of knowledge and the roles and is, with respect to PCVE, is that knowledge is absent at that level. So there is a need to make sure that there are policies that govern local governance and that deal with national security, integrate PCVE elements in there, and that integration is shared across policy implementing, policy development, and policy whatever, the resources that go into that. So a national policy dialogue is critical with respect to PCVE, with the goal to strengthen national local cooperation in which local actors participate in conversations with national level leaders.
I mean, it is one of the good practices, so I cannot endorse that strongly enough. And I think what you said builds on a little bit what you said earlier about the capacity building that's given to different actors needs to be appropriate for the role that they can play. So, for example, local actors don't benefit from the traditional kind of security focused, or may not benefit from the traditional kind of security focused approach to trainings on countering extremism. So thank you for sharing. Risky, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. So based on my personal opinion, that since we're talking about the national local cooperation, the key is on the cooperation. I mean that if we would like to have good national local cooperation, the cooperation itself coming from the trust between the national government agency and also the local government agencies. So my recommendation is that within Indonesia context, the trust between the national and local government agency is still considerably low. So which affects the implementation, the implementation of the preventing and countering violent extremism related programs. So I think that sometimes to enhance the trust among the actors at the national and the local levels, the recommendation is very simple. It's just conduct the regular meeting among the actors, because sometimes in Indonesia, the trust is not there simply because the actors never meet each other. So it's like they don't know each other. They don't trust. They don't know how to if I facing this issue, who I should contact, something like that. So it's like because the regular meetings among the actors that discuss specific on the preventing and countering violent extremism in Indonesia is very limited. So based on my opinion, because we, my organization, supporting some meetings that between the local government agencies at the local level, and it shows that the trust among the agencies is increasing currently. So I think that regular meeting is very important to build the trust, and the trust also could aiming to the further collaboration and cooperation. That's all. Actually, the recommendation is very simple, but hard to do. Easier said than done, actually.
Yeah. No, it's a good recommendation. These efforts can't just be a one-off. There needs to be regularity in the kind of coordination that we're talking about and in the consultation that we're talking about. It can't just be, limited to one instance where people come together to discuss the challenges and solutions. It needs to continue as those solutions are rolled out. Thank you all very much. We've got about 8 minutes left, just conscious of time, and we do have a couple of questions in the chat. The first one I will pick out is, how can we generate more resources to improve local, regional, and national cooperation? The example being, in Somalia, resource shortage is a key factor for lack of cooperation. Any responses on overcoming the challenge of a lack of resources? Christopher.
Just because it was Somalia, I thought I'd come in. Firstly, I think there are a lot of other reasons that PCV work doesn't work in Somalia beyond resources. But there is actually, you'll see in our report, quite a lot of positive developments in terms of sort of local initiatives or initiatives by the federal member states to put into practice some of the national action plan and strategy. In terms of funding, I don't think we're in a place where we're going to get any more funding in the PCV space. I think we need to reconsider how PCV works, and I think that comes back to what Charlotte said about PCV being integrated better with other initiatives, or taking account better of PCV sort of sensitivities when conducting development programs. So I don't think it's about getting more money, because there's a lot of international funding historically in Somalia. That's not necessarily the solution to PCV. Just pump more money at it. And just to build on one thing about local action plans and funding those, I think these don't necessarily, as Charlotte said, need to be PCV local action plans. They can be local development plans that account for CV sensitivity. So I think, my answer is that more money isn't necessarily what's needed. It's money from the right places and not necessarily from an agenda which doesn't align with local understandings.
Thank you. We do have another question specifically for Dr. Asha. This is from when you were speaking. What needs to be done to harmonize collaboration between authorities? Quite a broad question, but I think let's open it up for discussion.
Benefit from contributions from my colleagues, but once again, there are quite a lot of issues to address around collaboration with authorities. There are elements where PCVE has been politicized, and therefore interventions, activities are undertaken to target political opponents, and so many other things. So I think, in my opinion, as I have said, the consultative process and the dialogue to map out the scope of that cooperation and the elements contained in a prevention and countering violent extremism, in which security and national, local, senior authorities participate fully, could be a very good starting point, so that the collaboration addresses whatever fears are there, what limitations, and then strategies are collaboratively developed or jointly developed. It's not sufficient to say we need to have the United Nations coming down on local authorities or national authorities to speak to them about the need to tone down the approach. It has to be homegrown, and I think a dialogue and a consultative process to address related fears. It's not that what they are doing is not necessary in its own right at some level, with respect to securitization, for instance, but it has to be understood in the context that it is intended to serve, responding to violent extremism and not anything else. And that requires a conversation, a dialogue, and a consultation to set up those, to clarify those perimeters and the roles and redress any threats and fears that are associated with that.
Thank you. Francis, did you want to jump in?
Yes, I just wanted to add to that. A typical example of that level of harmonization is what we've seen in Niger, where the Center for Strategic Studies has carried out in partnership with the High Authority for Peace Consolidation, have carried out quarterly coordination meetings with the various CVE or countering violent extremism stakeholders, be it CSOs or local elected officials. First of all, to build their capacity, and then secondly, to understand what are the initiatives that CSOs are implementing on the ground, and how can local government authorities be part of that. So these periodic meetings bring everyone together around the table to at least not only throw light on what is being done, but also share lessons on the dynamics that are different from one region to the other. So I thought that I could highlight that as well. Yeah, over.
Thank you so much. Anything from any of our other panelists on this specific question? No, thank you. We do have another question, a really good question about how do we overcome poor governance, whether that's at a local or national level. I don't know if anyone wants to give an immediate response. Otherwise, we will jot the question down and respond via email. How do we overcome the challenge of poor governance when we want to improve national local cooperation to prevent and counter violent extremism? Christopher.
I think we have 2 minutes left. It's impossible to answer dealing with poor governance in across the world. But I think that the recommendations that really have come out of all our reporting is about following the good practices. That's why they're there. And I think there is a lot of recommendations in those good practices which do deal with governance issues and good governance issues. But obviously the broader structural challenges around good governance are beyond the means of PCV as a sector, I think. I think the final thing I wanted to note as well is that a sort of campaign I'm on at the moment is to sort of make people rethink how we use these labels like PCV and CVE. And I thought that was a nice way for me to finish, is that just to say that our studies have shown, local communities have completely different interpretations of what these words mean. So I think if you're starting at a point where your program or your initiative or your government strategy assumes a knowledge of an issue which the people you're working for and trying to help have a different understanding of what those words mean, then you're not that. Yeah, it's not a good step one. Yeah,
thank you. I think that's a great way to close the session. So I'm now going to wrap up. Well, firstly, a big thank you to our distinguished speakers, Francis, Christopher, Rizky, and Dr. Ashad. We will be sharing, as I mentioned earlier, the policy brief that combines the findings of our different speakers into a single paper. We will be sharing all of that via email in the next coming days. These findings, as I mentioned earlier, will also inform a toolkit that we're developing in partnership with the Global Counterterrorism Forum on the implementation of these good practices. My colleagues pasted the memorandum into the chat earlier. I advise that you open the link and have a read through. The toolkit will launch in September 2023. In the meantime, feel free to get in touch with us if you have any more questions. Our email is info@strongcitiesnetwork.org, which has also been pasted into the chat, or have a look at our website, www.strongcitiesnetwork.org. Thank you all for joining, and thank you again to our 4 speakers today. And with that, I will close.